And they kind of have a mandate.
It was
The Minister of Environment.
Duncan Fee was the best, I think.
Powerful. So,
But the grass is always green.
and now that we're past elections, you know, they can actually get back to work and
Yeah.
do things. Whereas before, it wasn't possible. Yeah. So we're not that a lot of people, but we're gonna have a record of this thing, right? Online, we're sort of speaking
Okay.
to all the future downloaders.
Oh, great.
And then the live stream sign-ups seem to be impressive.
great,
So,
Yeah, I think we've
folks are-
seen that shift where people live stream instead of coming.
It's true. Oh, yeah, it's true. Yeah, you can join even if you have other meetings and stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Sometimes though, if you don't live stream, you get a better audience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
forces that in person.
Right.
Venues,
Yeah.
Strategies.
yeah.
So you all can sit anywhere you want.
Okay.
I'll sit here, and Courtney's gonna
I'll
be
sit
there.
here.
Are you running
Well,
back and forth
we
between
can pass
slideshows?
the clicker along. I just
Yeah.
have the keyboard here for when we need to change for Michelle's PowerPoint, and then we've got just a general Stimson background for when you're
Oh,
speaking.
great. I was gonna say, I have no slides, so
Neither
my
do I.
comments might be
Yeah,
a
we'll just-
little
we'll just stick a
high level, but kind of
background.
prompting,
That's fine.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and then let's watch time.
Mm.
And I think if we stick to our time limits,
Yeah.
which there's never any guarantee with me and Courtney.
I've been practicing narrowing.
We will have a discussion amongst ourselves. So
Great.
I want you all to ask us questions
Mhm.
first, and then we'll
Yeah.
turn it over.
Okay,
Um,
perfect.
And I'll order. So we'll start with Michelle,
Mhm.
discussions, and then to Clara,
Clara.
and then to Jack last. Because Clara's going to do, these are kind of renewable energy transition opportunities
Yeah.
in Asia and Cambodia. And we can do it.
Yeah.
You can get into the U.S. and kind of a deeper details
Investment
of
interest.
investment
Yeah.
interests and,
Yeah.
and then deeper details of what you know about Cambodia's
Mhm.
OCA.
Yeah. Cool.
Awesome.
Yeah. Let's wait.
I'm gonna grab some water.
Yeah. We should all grab some.
Yeah,
water.
I know I did the water plus coffee, because I thought coffee alone would be.
Sure. We're gonna wait about 5 minutes, 3 minutes, and then we'll get started. Hopefully, there's a big line of attendees downstairs waiting to check in. But with Cambodia events, it's always tough to draw a big crowd.
Got some quality.
Thank you, sir. Don, good to see you.
How are you?
Is Irene stay at home?
No, she's parking.
Okay.
That's always the biggest problem.
Well, you know there's a garage in the bottom.
Here in this building. Which street?
How long have you been with the council?
About 3.5, close to 4 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, there's plenty of garages. We spread the parking.
I think before Nicole, there was Rachel Wagley
Yeah.
that was working, and so she was involved in U.S. campaign for Burma.
Yes, yeah, but
So
she,
I was working on, well, we're not on the same side of the political rhetoric,
yeah.
but I've interacted with her
She's a
when
great
I was
person.
with in the advisory group.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted to say hello to you.
Hello.
Roseanne Guerin from Radio Free Asia.
Hi, pleasure to meet you, Roseanne.
Yeah,
How
and
are
I'm
you?
covering you.
Yeah,
Would you like
to the hot water.
Okay, do you want cold water also?
Fantastic.
Kind of do, but I don't want to be the crazy person with 3 cups.
What's John Minton still in the MR service, and Nancy, are they still?
No, Nancy retired.
Nancy retired.
Yeah, and now.
I know Nancy very well.
Cho Cha Ong.
Cha-cha.
He's running the department.
Okay.
The director.
This is why I need her everywhere as my supportive office champion.
Yeah, I was on RFA several times, actually. I was there just a few months back when I visited Myanmar, on the Myanmar program.
Right.
We did an exclusive on U.S.-Myanmar economic relations.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, well, I just wanted to say hello to you. You may be hearing from me in the future.
Please, anytime.
And you're Michelle?
I'm Clara.
Claire, okay.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, hi, Roseanne. Radio
Roseanne.
Free Asia.
Hi. I'll give you it.
Okay. Great.
There you go.
Okay. Are you doing anything with Myanmar or?
So we cover Asia broadly, and I would say we don't have a Myanmar-specific initiative, but we've looked at it over the years through its energy security.
Okay.
We've been thinking, I think we just released something on the Rohingya as well, so
Yeah.
more from our pure security
Oh,
side,
okay.
but that would be a different team in our
Right,
office. So.
right. Now, do you make those reports all public or on the website? Or?
Most of them are public. I think all our reports are now public. Q&As. Asia
Oh,
Policy
thanks so
is a journal, so sometimes it's through that Project News subscription. But for media in particular, if you ever just send our head of outreach,
Kevin
a
used to
note,
work with me
they
at USABC.
want people
I know,
to have
yeah,
access.
I remember that was one thing we
So-
kept in mind when we took him on as our intern.
All right.
Thank you.
And you're Courtney?
Yes.
And I'm Roseanne from Radio Free Asia, and I was sitting next to you last week at the East-West Center.
Yes.
But I just wanted to say hi and give you a card. Do you have one?
I just ran out the other day, so I'm waiting
Okay.
for a new order to come
Yeah,
in.
okay, and I'm supposed to have a little sit-down with Brian after he gets finished with the presentation, so if you want to sit in on that, that's fine.
If I have to make a lunch meeting
Oh,
before
okay.
but if
So-
there's time, I will.
Okay, thanks.
What's this for? Okay, so Catherine should do this. I'll give it to Catherine.
Somehow my last trip on my cars. Oh, I'm in exactly that same boat. So frustrating. With one card. Thank you. Sure. See if I can take them. Ross, your portfolio, is it Asia, Southeast Asia, members globally? Oh, so you've got one of those narrow task things, you know? Oh, let me hand it to
Yes.
you.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That's great.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. It's just so overly ambitious.
I want to welcome everybody to the Stimson Center for the launch of our new report toward a sustainable water, energy, food future in Cambodia. My name is Brian Eiler, and I'm the director of the Stimson Center Southeast Asia program and also our Energy, Water, and Sustainability program. And those of you who have been following our work for a long time might know that this Letters from the Mekong series has been long producing policy reports. This is the 5th in our series. And we're very proud to have a second publication that focuses on a particular country. 2 years ago, we had a report that looked at Laos, a need for what we call system-scale strategic planning for its hydropower sector. And this one takes a deep dive into some smart policy solutions, not just for Cambodia's government, but for neighbors in Southeast Asia, for Vietnam, for Thailand, for Laos, and also for the United States government, who is seeking to engage in the Mekong region in a new and more pragmatic way, starting this year through several different Indo-Pacific initiatives. You might know us for our history of discussing the risks related to hydropower development in the Mekong. We've been long working to bridge the science policy gap, to expose risks related to what we see as an overambitious and an unwise plan for hydropower development in countries like Laos and Cambodia, as well as China. And also, you might know us for the promotion of alternatives. And we work, and when I say we, this is we, my colleague Courtney Weatherby, and me, and our Senior Distinguished Fellow, Richard Cronin, at the policy level to promote these alternatives to decision makers in Cambodia, in Laos and Vietnam, Thailand and Myanmar, China, and here in the United States. This report isn't only for a decision maker audience. We think that civil society, which is hard at work at promoting sustainable future in the Mekong, will find interesting recommendations and useful recommendations in this report, as well as some of its findings that will be useful for a media audience, an academic audience, a broad range of stakeholders interested in what's happening in the Mekong. You know, typically the story of Cambodia and the Mekong revolves around the Sambor Dam. All right, the Sambor Dam is a mainstream dam on the Mekong that is said to, if it is built above Phnom Penh, will be 18 kilometers wide, because it will be built at a part of the river where there are no mountains for which the size of the dam to latch onto. It's a 2,600 megawatt mega dam that would, as the headline suggests, kill the Mekong, and certainly it would. It would cut off all connectivity to the Tonle Sap Lake. The picture on our cover shows fishers out early in the morning on the Tonle Sap. And the Tonle Sap is critically important for the food security, and I'm going to get into that in my presentation, food security and future of Cambodia. But we want to steer the attention away from just focusing on the Sambor Dam and promoting alternatives, and also remember that Cambodia's portion of the Mekong Basin takes up most of the country. So whatever rivers are dammed in Cambodia, with the exception of the coastal portions, are going to impact the Mekong. It's going to impact the Mekong's portion of the Cambodia's portion of the Mekong Basin, but also the entirety of the Mekong as a whole. So we're going to shift the discourse from one point of focus to the need for a basin-wide view of what's happening in the Mekong. And we think that the time is now to deliver some of these smart solutions. We couldn't do this 5 years ago. The state of play for market development for, say, non-hydropower renewables such as solar and wind wasn't where it is today 5 years ago. And so now we can have a robust and useful discussion about these alternative energy and power generation options for Cambodia. And at the same time, the state of technical planning approaches for basin-wide development is at a point where now we can consider trade-offs at a large scale of power development, fisheries impacts to resettlement, forestry, navigation, et cetera, not just at, again, the particular point of a project itself, but from a basin-wide scale. And we can apply these techniques to optimize all of those. So you can move forward with some energy development, some power development, and know what impacts to that development will be on, say, fisheries and water flow, water availability, impacts to communities, impacts to downstream countries like Vietnam, et cetera. We've developed some very useful recommendations from this report. I'm going to talk more about the kind of impacts to the Tonle Sap in my presentation. My colleague Courtney Weatherby will be discussing renewable energy opportunities arising in Cambodia and the pressure to build out, which is a very real thing in Cambodia to meet power demand needs. And we've invited three excellent discussions to join us and to get our discussion going, to demonstrate the opportunities that come from some of our recommendations. So first we have Michelle Thiem, who is the lead conservation scientist for freshwater at the WWF, and she's going to discuss concepts related to connectivity and keeping rivers free-flowing and the importance of a free-flowing Mekong. And Clara Gillespie from NBR, who is the Senior Director of Trade, Economic, Energy, and Energy Affairs, is going to kind of take a deeper dive into the broader strokes of the renewable energy transition as it's playing out in Asia. And we've also invited Jack Mint, who's an associate at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, who can perhaps outline the opportunities for U.S. investment and outside investment in Cambodia's energy future and Cambodia's water future. And Jack runs the Cambodia desk at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. So to jump right into my presentation, we've shown this map many times. This is a map that demonstrates what is being built in terms of hydropower in Laos and Cambodia, and we've turned the dots on for Laos and Cambodia because this represents the future. Vietnam has dammed all of its rivers. There are no more hydropower plants to be built there. Thailand is the same. The orange dots on this map show the future pipeline or an inventory of potential dams. So we don't like to use the word plan because plans always change, and certainly neither Laos nor Cambodia has a strict pipeline plan for the build-out of the future of this map. The lighter green dots show dams that are under construction, and the dark green dots are dams that are already completed. And this is very much up to date. What this map shows is there's a big difference between the future of Laos and Cambodia. Cambodia's future is much more flexible than, say, Laos. You'll see many more green dots on the map in Laos. You'll see many dots in general. There are over 130 on that particular map. So 130 dams in Laos's inventory for current and future development, and about 40 in Cambodia. And the reason for this discrepancy is that Laos has purposed its energy development sector for the export of hydropower to the rest of the neighborhood. Cambodia is not in this position. Cambodia needs to meet its own energy and power generation demands now. So this map, by and large, represents a way to meet those domestic demands and not consider export of power to its neighborhood. Also, you'll see that Cambodia's development is much slower out of the gates than Laos's. So most of the dots on Cambodia's Mekong, with the exception of the Lower Sason 2 dam, which is built at the confluence of two really critically important rivers in Cambodia's western provinces, the Sason and the Srepok. With the exception of that dam, there are no other hydropower dams in Cambodia's portions of the Mekong. But what this map doesn't show you is 6 irrigation dams that are built around the Tonle Sap Lake that have impacts on this Tonle Sap Lake. Also, what this map doesn't show you is what are the alternatives? What is Cambodia's solar availability? What is the wind availability? This map kind of, even though it comes from us, it views the region as a power shed, only for the development of power. And it doesn't show you alternatives. It also doesn't show you what would be the impacts of these dams on connectivity, on environmental flows that are critically important for the Mekong Basin. And the other thing that this map doesn't show you is the origin of life in the Mekong. A lot of us, when we think about the Mekong River, we think of its headwaters rising in China, in the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau. So the water, indeed, comes from upstream. But life, in many ways, comes from the Tonle Sap Lake. Many of the over 1,000 species of fish that thrive throughout the entirety of the Mekong Basin, and they're the long, traveling, migrating fish, spend a portion of their life in the Tonle Sap. So the Tonle Sap Lake, which is in Cambodia, it's the largest freshwater body of water in Southeast Asia, is in many ways the beating heart of the Mekong system. And that Mekong system produces more freshwater fish than any other river system in the world. 2.6 million tons of fish come out of the Mekong Basin. Compared to North America, all of North America's rivers and lakes only produce 160,000 tons. And by and large, this is because we've cut off the connectivity of our rivers by building dams and barrages across our rivers, and that stops the flow of the freshwater fish. And therefore, the consideration of freshwater fish into our own diets here in the United States is not a major consideration. But in a country like Cambodia, 70% of Cambodia's protein intake comes from what comes out of its portion of the Mekong Basin. And that lake itself, the Tonle Sap Lake, produces a freshwater fish catch of 500,000 tons a year, multiples of what all of our rivers and lakes in North America do combined. And the magic, or rather there are complex scientific processes that produce this fish, this explosion of fish population in Tonle Sap, in the Tonle Sap. And this report details some of that. And our bibliography quotes a large number of scientific peer-reviewed reports that go into the details of how this happens. But one thing we can know and rely on is that so much water flows down through the Mekong system during the monsoon season that when that water reaches Phnom Penh, which is where the confluence of the river coming out of the Tonle Sap Lake meets the Mekong mainstream, that river reverses its direction and sends 70 times more water that's in the lake during the dry season back into that lake. And you have this huge expansion of water into the floodplain around the lake. So this picture demonstrates, this picture here is the same spot. I'm standing at the same spot in Kampong Klang village on the Tonle Sap, the dry season and monsoon season difference, where as much as a 9-meter rise of water impacts this the communities and the flooded areas around this lake. So one easy way to think about how to keep the Tonle Sap Lake productive in terms of fisheries is more water, more fish. So the higher the floods will bring in more fish. And when you talk to communities around this lake, they'll tell you that. And the thing to know about communities, of which there are over 400,000 around this lake and drawing resources off this lake, and 400,000 individuals, is that the population going to the lakeside is increasing. Typically you hear of rural to urban migration, so pressures like Phnom Penh's population pressures are increasing rapidly. However, this lakeside population is increasing, not as fast as Phnom Penh, but they're coming there. Why? Because of resource access, and that the water and the fish availability, water also for agricultural purposes, provides for a robust livelihood. And some of them, if you talk to them, say it's much better than what you can get in a city like Phnom Penh, where rural people are often, they have to face the challenge of being integrated into, say, the manufacturing sector or finding jobs in the service sector, where it's hard to integrate one's life into an urban economy. The Tonle Sap, this diagram shows basically the size of that floodplain, and also shows the current state of development around the Tonle Sap Lake and in Cambodia's portion of the Mekong. You can see in the top northeast corner there is one dam, the Lower Say Son 2, which is a 400 megawatt dam, and then those irrigation dams around the lake. We do not know what the impact of those irrigation dams are on water availability, the sediment flow coming into the lake, and then fish migration impacts. So this is a gap in the research that needs further study. Also, we do not know the total impact of what upstream dam development will do to the Tonle Sap. We can understand some of the natural dynamics around it, the natural impacts. So what dams do are they send more water, if they're regulating the river, more water into the system during the dry season to make water more available, and hold back more water during the monsoon season. And the idea around this is that if upstream dams are built, it's going to impact the size of the flood zone around the Tonle Sap Lake. And therefore, this will have an impact on fisheries availability in the Tonle Sap floodplain and Cambodia at large. So with more water in the system during the dry season, this will increase the size of the Tonle Sap Lake, okay, of the permanent lake. And with less water coming into the lake during the monsoon season, this will decrease the size of the floodplain. A scientist at Finland's Aalto University has run a couple different scenarios of the impacts on the future of upstream dams to the lake, and believes that one of the business as usual scenarios shows that the floodplain size of the Tonle Sap will reduce to 75% of its current area. Now, what is the impact of the reduction of water to this Tonle Sap on fisheries catches, on local populations, on Cambodia's food security situation? These are all unknown, and they require further study. What we did was took a stab at this, okay, and to think about connectivity impacts, because we know, again, the more water to flow into the Tonle Sap, the more fish. But it's not just about water. Sediment transport into the Tonle Sap is critically important, and dams hold this back. Migratory fish access into the Tonle Sap and then out of the Tonle Sap, because this not only does the river reverse direction, but it returns to its original course during the dry season. So you have this yearly rhythmic change of expansion and contraction that brings things in and takes things out. And building a dam anywhere in this basin, particularly those dams that are closer to the river, closer to the Tonle Sap, will impact that rhythm. So we said, what is the current state of connectivity to Cambodia's 11,000 kilometers of rivers in its portion of the Mekong Basin? By considering the Lower Saison 2 dam, as well as these 6 irrigation reservoirs, and then one other dam built around the Tonle Sap that is producing about 13 megawatts of power. So I think my former slide is a better one to look at. Yes, that produces 13 megawatts of power. And in terms of trade-offs, we want to consider, is Cambodia getting a good deal out of this in terms of its impacts to the resources that its people draw from day to day? So with the building of those 2 dams, Cambodia's energy power generation demand has been met by an increase of 413 megawatts, but a loss of 32% of 3,500 kilometers of connectivity by just essentially damming those 2 critically important Saison and Srepak rivers with the Lower Saison 2 dam. Is this worth it? This is a question that Cambodian decision makers should answer. But going forward, well, to demonstrate this connectivity loss on a graph, we showed the lost 2 kilometers for various rivers, and this is in the report as well. So the blue portions of each river here laid out on this graph shows the length of the rivers and tributaries. The blue portion is a free-flowing section. If the bar changes from blue to gray, then there's a dam at that point, all right? And what is above that point is considered not free-flowing and not connected. So this graph demonstrates that connectivity loss. In Cambodia, most projects are built out on a project-by-project basis. So it's very likely that the Cambodian government could produce a pipeline that would minimize connectivity without considering connectivity impacts to the Tonle Sap system. If project-by-project approaches are taken. So we considered a scenario of what would the worst case look like? And the worst case, if we remember that building a dam closest to the Tonle Sap would have the greatest impact on connectivity and fish populations, well, we looked at Cambodia's inventory and said, let's put a dam at the closest points on each of the rivers in Cambodia to the Tonle Sap. What would this give Cambodia's energy needs in terms of a contribution to power generation? And then what would the impacts to connectivity be? So this would produce 7 more dams, 237 megawatts of power, not a lot of power, total of 747 megawatts of power, but have another 1/3 increase of connectivity loss to a total loss of more than 60%. So this is very profound. And it says that the country could kind of stumble along and put itself in a very risky position moving forward. Well, then we took another idea, another crack at this idea of connectivity and promoting connectivity. And and asked, is there a maximized scenario out there that would not necessarily have impacts to Tonle Sap connectivity? And this one is considering what is already built. Are there areas above what is already built that are in Cambodia's inventory that would not have any further downstream effects? So taking Cambodia's dam inventory, we said, what if you only build dams above that Lower Sason 2 400 megawatt dam? How much could you get out of this? How much could the country meet its own domestic energy needs? And the result is about 1,700 megawatts of power, which is half of Cambodia's current power capacity. So now this is really, bringing some power online and potentially having zero connectivity impacts downstream because you're building below a lower downstream project. So this is the type of programmatic, basin-wide scenario development that could be useful to inform Cambodian decision makers as well as investors, as well as development partners that are looking to help the country move forward and meet its power generation needs. But we do have our own worries about this potential scenario. This is one of Cambodia's most ethnically diverse portions of the country. If these people are resettled, how are their resettlement needs, their cultural and social needs being met in that resettlement process if a scenario like this would move forward? Is there really no upstream connectivity impact? Is something that needs to be discovered, needs to be studied. So are fish moving around that system inside? And what would those impacts be? And then this would require a major increase in transmission build-out if this particular scenario would be considered. But it's one that would meet strategically particular energy demand needs in Vietnam. Cross-border power trade transmission lines could be strung in this area to send power into Ho Chi Minh City, where there's an energy deficit, but then also to Cambodia at large by meeting the increasing pressures of power demand in Phnom Penh and other urbanizing areas. So the need for alternatives, analysis, development of scenarios like this at a basin-wide scale is of the utmost importance. So we hope to kind of discursively demonstrate the power of some of these scenarios to stakeholders in Cambodia. I'm going to turn my presentation over to my colleague Courtney Weatherby, who's going to talk about Cambodia's power sector and opportunities for renewable energy development.
Yes, thank you, Brian. So as Brian mentioned, he's reviewed sort of the connectivity water side of things here, and I really want to talk about the drivers for all of the hydropower that's being built in Cambodia, because although you saw a few irrigation projects on those maps that Brian was showing you, by and large, the future planned dams in Cambodia for the production of power. So looking at Cambodia's current energy mix and energy demand, we can see that it's on a very rapid growth path. In recent years, the energy demand growth annually has been between 10 and 20%. So you can see it's rising very rapidly. It's coming from a relatively low starting point. As of 2017, despite that rapid growth, Cambodia has only got just over 2,400 megawatts of installed capacity. Now, comparing that to its neighbors, Thailand has, I believe at the moment, almost 40,000 megawatts of installed capacity. Vietnam's more than 30,000 and is projected to rise to more than 90,000 by 2030. So Cambodia, through the entirety of the region, is relatively low. So coming from a low starting point. If you look at the energy mix, almost all of that is hydropower. More than half of that is from 9 hydropower plants that have already been built, including the Lower Sason 2 project that Brian mentioned. The remainder comes primarily from fossil fuels. Coal is the second largest input. Diesel fuel is there as well, and then imports. So if you're looking at the chart here, the brown is imports, mostly from Vietnam, some from Thailand in border provinces. But if you think about sort of the diversity of this mix, it's actually a little bit less than this shows because those imports are largely hydropower and coal as well. So looking to the future, Cambodia needs not only to rapidly build out many more power plants to meet energy demands in Phnom Penh, in Siem Reap, and in rural areas that are increasingly electrified, but it also needs to diversify its energy portfolio in order to be truly flexible and resilient and a future of climate change where hydropower is less reliable than it is now and is also a seasonal producer. So 3 key trends to consider in Cambodia's energy growth are electrification. Currently, if you look at the country, almost 70% of people in the country have some access to electricity. And there's a wide disparity between the rural areas and the urban areas. In Phnom Penh, electrification is about 97%. So you can see that that dropped down to 70% is because there are many villages and rural areas that have no access to electricity at all. And the Cambodian government has made it a priority to build out transmission to rural areas and try to improve electrification and electricity access for its rural population. The other key aspect is affordability. Cambodia has one of the highest rates of electricity in all of ASEAN. Up until very recently, it was not unheard of to pay more than 25 cents per kilowatt hour in Phnom Penh in rural areas, and often more than 80 cents in Phnom Penh and in other urban areas, and then often more than 80 cents in rural areas where people were relying on imported diesel fuel generators to electrify their village for light bulbs, refrigerators, and other basic needs. So the
And Courtney,
government.
how does that stack up to prices around the region?
Yes, so when you look at prices in neighboring countries, although many of them have subsidies, it's far lower. It's usually on average between 5 and 8 cents per kilowatt hour in its neighbors. So you can see that Cambodia is paying a very heavy price for the electricity that it has. So it's a key goal of the government to drop this price. They've essentially said moving forward they're going to lower the amount that they're willing to sign for contracts from new electricity producers. They're not going to sign anything that's more than, I believe it was 10 or 11 cents moving forward, and they're aiming to drop the rates below 12 cents for consumers within the next 5 years. Finally, I'd already mentioned diversification is sort of another key goal of the government. Moving forward, they don't want to rely just on hydropower, they don't want to rely just on coal. They want to diversify the supply and also improve the national supply so that they're not importing so much from neighbors, because when you look at that 400 megawatts of imports from Vietnam or Thailand, that's a very large percentage of Cambodia's electricity supply. So broadly speaking, one of the big challenges that Cambodia and many other developing countries around the world and in the Mekong region have faced is the capacity to do national coordinated electricity plans. Cambodia has had various plans in the past, but many of them were not coordinated, so they might have been sectorally focused. So the most recent and most comprehensive to date was the 2016 Master Energy Plan, which Cambodia produced with the support of JICA. And it is still essentially a list of planned projects. So it's not necessarily alternative scenarios. It's not, they're not looking at different scenarios for demand growth. They're not looking at different scenarios for build out of energy supply in the country. It's an inventory of the projects that have already been proposed, some of which have already been signed for under contract and which are planned to be built out. So looking at the plan, it's got almost 2,800 megawatts of planned projects through 2020. And it's important to consider that this 2016 plan is in many ways already quite outdated. A number of those planned projects are not on track to be completed by 2020. A couple of the major projects, including the Stung Treng and Sambor dams, which are included on that list to be completed in the early 2020s, have not even seriously started feasibility studies yet. In many other cases, natural gas from various regions has been delayed. So Cambodia is facing sort of this challenge of getting power quickly to meet that electricity demand, which may not come from the initially planned sources. That plan, without getting into the details of the projects included, is still largely dominated by hydropower and coal. There's one plant which could be either a thermal coal or a thermal gas plant that is included. But notably, there is no wind or solar inclusion. There's no serious discussion of biomass contribution to the national energy supply through that plan. That said, it will be updated regularly. So there is some flexibility here as Cambodia's energy planners respond to market shifts and to investor interest in other regional developments in the energy market. So just briefly on Cambodia's energy mix moving forward, I think one important thing to consider is the role of coal. Southeast Asia tends to be an outlier when you're looking at global trends, global shifts towards renewable energy sources. If you look at the total amount of investment by resource, for instance, solar and wind outstripped fossil fuels rapidly in recent years with the total investment. Cambodia and many of its neighbors in Southeast Asia are actually turning that on their head. Of the top 20 investors in future coal capacity in the world, 5 of them are in Southeast Asia. Cambodia is number 19, with just over 3,000 megawatts of planned coal expansion in the country. So that is something of a surprise, given that Cambodia's domestic coal supply is not very large, and also just given sort of the market trends that we're seeing globally with the drop in price for renewable energy technologies. Secondly, sort of the renewable energy opportunity. As I mentioned, solar, wind, and biomass are not given really much attention at all in the 2016 Master Energy Plan. And while it is clear that officials in Cambodia are reconsidering that, we've seen a whole slew of shifts in recent years for consideration of alternative options, I think it's worth digging a little bit into what the actual resources are. So when you're looking at estimated energy resources for Cambodia, everyone has historically talked about the 10,000 megawatts of hydropower potential that the country has. However, very few people talk about the estimated 8,100 megawatts of solar potential that exist in the country, or the 6,500 megawatts of wind power that ADB and other studies have estimated. There's also an unclear amount of commercially viable offshore natural gas options, partly because of border disputes with Thailand and the Gulf that have made it very difficult to get in and do those studies or develop the projects. But obviously, when you're looking at sort of that portfolio and comparing it to the 2,400 megawatts that Cambodia has, there are many different scenarios for energy development inside the country. And it is seriously worth giving solar in particular a second look. When we think of what solar has been on the global scale in recent years, historically, obviously, everyone says there are 2 issues with it. It's variable, and it's extremely expensive. And that's something that we've heard echoed from policymakers in many countries in the Mekong region over the last 5 years. However, when you're looking at the global price of renewables, it's dropped rapidly in the last 10 years, particularly in the last 5 years, due to overcapacity production in China, shifts in innovations in financing models and construction models, and essentially we've seen about an 80% drop for solar and a 60% drop in wind on a global scale in recent years. So a lot of these resources, which previously were far outside the bounds, are now something that policymakers can consider. And we have seen that reflected in some of the interviews we've held with policymakers in the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Cambodia. When we first spoke with them a few years ago, one of them said, we love the idea of solar and wind. It's not going to be feasible here for 10 years. It's just too expensive. We don't know how to integrate it effectively into the grid. We just don't think it's viable. And half a year later, because of the investor interest and the price drops and the various studies that are really showing these other projects around the world are feasible.
And with some of our own work, too.
And with some of our own work. I hope that we've contributed to some of this shift in mindset. They were saying, we want to be looking at solar. And the Asian Development Bank has also been a key player here, because when you look at sort of the solar projects underway in Cambodia right now, 2 of them, and the only one that's already constructed and producing electricity, have been supported by the Asian Development Bank. So in 2017, work began on the 10 megawatt first pilot project for commercial sale into the grid, which is the Bavet Solar Farm, one of the smaller cities in Cambodia. It produces 10 megawatts, which really supports that city, and it's selling electricity into the grid at a price of about just over 9 cents per kilowatt hour. So when you compare that to sort of historical perceptions of price, it's really showing that with the right policy framework and support in place, and in this case, concessional loans from the ADB, given the very small size of this project and the regulatory environment in the country, that it is feasible to get economically competitive solar projects. Since then, we've seen sort of this slew of investor interest coming in. So ADB is also supporting discussion of a 100 megawatt 2-phase solar park in the country. There's I believe, Chinese-supported 60 megawatt project in Kampong Spo province, which is going to be coming online by the end of 2019. And there was just a recent announcement of a 135 megawatt project that American investors are interested in supporting, which is still under discussion, but which has received a generally positive response in principle from the government. One thing we'd also really like to highlight, which is the solar opportunity in Cambodia, is just looking at the solar radiation compared to the land opportunities. Obviously, economic land concessions, land grabbing. These are issues in Cambodia. They've been political issues in the past. They're issues of development moving forward because of the need to fairly compensate people who are being moved off, often reluctantly and against their will, from agricultural land in order to support economic land concessions. This has been a big challenge. However, it is potentially an opportunity moving forward. There are many cases where damage has been done. Economic land concessions have already been gathered. They're large. They've got thousands of hectares in some cases. And in many cases, these were for commodity projects and plantations that never ended up happening because the price of commodities dropped. So you've got essentially many economic land concessions lying fallow around the country. So they're not making money for anyone. People are still not allowed back on that land. Many have, out of necessity, moved on with their lives. There is potential opportunity here to rezone some of these economic land concessions as solar farms. So if you're looking at the map here, you'll see each of those sort of square outlines is an economic land concession in Cambodia. And many of them align with areas of strong solar radiation and could potentially be profitable solar projects. So we think it's worth considering that the government consider working with the economic land concession owners to rezone some of these projects as solar farms, open them up for auction, and assist with the country's energy supply. Finally, just summarizing the recommendations from both Brian's and my presentations for Cambodia, we really do think that basin-wide system-scale planning for Cambodia to quantify the trade-offs and develop different scenarios for the development of the energy mix, and with varying impacts on the environmental flows in the country, is really important moving forward in making sure that Cambodia chooses that least impact method that will meet its needs without doing damage to key communities and key environmental flows and ecosystem services. We think it's an opportunity for Cambodia right now because they're in that sort of regular revision of the Master Energy Plan, and there is so much internal discussion about regulatory changes to the energy system to facilitate a policy, regulatory, and the physical infrastructure that's necessary to support non-hydropower investments in renewable energy. And this could be something as simple as establishing a clear target, because currently, despite some shifts in policy that are supportive of renewables, the government of Cambodia hasn't actually set a target for this renewable energy to be included in its energy mix. It could also be moving forward with the Asian Development Bank supported 100-megawatt solar park. That would provide some very important lessons learned with a larger tender on an open auction that could be utilized moving forward to ensure that renewable energy investments are sustainable economically as well as environmentally, and also working with the foreign leaseholders and ELCs that are lying fallow to try and rezone some of those projects for solar production. It would allow for those projects to come online relatively quickly compared to, for instance, a dam, which takes 5 to 7 years to construct and is often contentious and, as Brian highlighted, potentially very seriously damaging for Cambodia's food security. And finally, doing all of this in a way that would maximize river connectivity, particularly from our analysis, the two key projects that really should be considered deeply and avoided, if possible, is the Sambor Dam and the Stung Dam, which are two mainstream dams on the Mekong, which would just kill connectivity to the Tonle Sap and have deep impacts on environmental flows and food security, particularly fisheries. The other is to keep the Sekong River free-flowing through Laos. So Brian had been showing that map earlier with the lower Sason 2 cutting off two key rivers for the Mekong system. The third tributary in that area is called the Sekong. It starts just in the border of Vietnam, flows through Laos and into Cambodia, and there are dams planned for that river. But it's the last free-flowing migration route for fish in the region, so cutting that river off would have almost as damaging an impact as some of those mainstream dams would. So it's vital to seriously consider options that would keep that river free-flowing. So that's summarizing our report. I think we'd love to move over to our discussants to get some comments, and I'm just going to pass the clicker over to Michelle.
So we're going to turn to Michelle Team from the WWF, who could continue this discussion of connectivity. And I'm glad, Courtney, that you ended on the idea of maximizing connectivity and keeping the Sekong free-flowing.
Thank you, and thanks so much for the Stimson Center for inviting me today, and congratulations on the publication of this excellent report. I'm happy to be here today, and I'm going to start by zooming out a bit, and what's on the screen is a global map. This is some work that WWF has led with partners to map the extent of free-flowing rivers globally. So what you're looking at is in blue are rivers that remain free-flowing from their source to the outlet. Those that are in green still maintain high levels of connectivity, and those that are red are fragmented or lost. And what you see is that most of the rivers that are where long free-flowing rivers remain are really concentrated in parts of the Arctic and in parts of the tropics in Amazon and Congo, areas that are really important for freshwater species and ecosystem services. In Southeast Asia, there are only 2 long free-flowing rivers left, the Irrawaddy and Salween rivers, but parts of the lower Mekong still maintain a green status of highly connected for long stretches. Just to emphasize, what do we mean by a free-flowing river? Actually, that was the very first part of this consortium that came together. I think there's, yeah, that's all of the groups that were involved in this assessment, was to define that. And I think an important component of this is that we're not just talking about dams, we're also talking about development in floodplains, because it's not just that upstream, downstream connectivity that's important for the services that rivers provide, like fisheries in the Tonle Sap, but it's also the connection to the floodplain. It's the connection over time, like when that water arrives, how much sediment it's bringing with it. One of the main issues we see globally is that we're experiencing sinking deltas, not only from climate change, but also from the amount of sediment that is being stored upstream behind dams. And then just, I think this report really emphasizes this for Cambodia and Cambodia's case, but the many values that are often hidden or forgotten of connected and healthy rivers. This graphic is a nice kind of pictorial display of all those different values, everything from what I just mentioned, sediment transfer to downstream floodplains and deltas, the agriculture that happens on those floodplains, the fish stocks, and so on. And sometimes when decisions are made that these hidden or forgotten values are not taken into consideration, and there are unintended impacts that happen. One example is how many people depend on the protein from the fisheries in the Mekong, and where will that protein come from if those fisheries are no longer there? Some other studies have pointed out that a lot of land would have to be cleared. There would have to be a lot of grain imported to feed the livestock, which would provide the protein to the people that live in this region. And this is what we know is coming. In red on this map, in gray are the existing dams. In red are the 3,700 planned dams. And I will say, WWF is not against dams. We very much recognize that hydropower is going to play a really important role in stability of grids into the future to allow renewables, other renewables into the system. It's also really important as we're thinking about our carbon emissions and lowering those. So there's a very strong role for hydropower into the future. But if all of these dams are built out, we will lose a lot of those hidden values and services that I mentioned before. And we think that there is a possible different path available. This is a bit of a similar graphic to one that you showed earlier, but at a global scale, looking at different projections by IEA and Teskey et al. Of how much hydropower will be needed in future scenarios of development, and different scenarios of the amount of impacts on fragmentation of rivers if those dams are planned in a systematic way versus if they're done project by project. So there's a real potential if upstream planning of dams happens early in the planning process, and we are thinking about the system as a whole to be able to minimize the loss of river connectivity and free-flowing rivers if we plan these dams far in advance. And you can see that delta there under basically where the blue line drops to under the Teskey et al. Bar. And in terms of WWF's work, these are the basins where we're focusing on this particular issue. Basically, we chose places where we already have a deep history and presence, where there's a lot of freshwater species and biodiversity, which is our core conservation interest, and where we know that this threat is looming to try and get out ahead of the curve. So Mekong is clearly one of those, the lower Mekong is clearly one of those places. And so just to say a few words before I close about our work there, we have had a long presence in the lower Mekong, particularly in this stretch of river between the Lao border and Karachi in Cambodia. And that is the stretch of river where the Sambor and Strung Tang dams are planned, the two that were mentioned earlier. And so one part of our work, well, we have a long history of working with the communities there, supporting them in fisheries management and also developing a tourism industry to come and see the Irrawaddy River dolphins that live along the river. And so we're quite concerned about the impacts of what these dams will have on those communities. We also are concerned about, of course, the wider impacts in terms of sediment flows to the Mekong Delta and so on, all of the things that Brian and Courtney have already spoken to this morning. Those two dams are right in this stretch, one at Stung Treng, one at Sambor, and one of the main aspects of our strategy is working around raising awareness about what those impacts will be, both within Cambodia but also with outside investors in China, in the US, and so on. And then the other part of our strategy is very much aligned with the Stimson Center's looking at alternative energy options. We have had a long experience working in the Mekong and very much understand that it's not enough to say no. There needs to be another pathway forward. And so what we've been focused on in 2016, we published a power sector vision for the entire region, including ones country by country that laid out a potential pathway for alternative energy options, how much would need to come from hydropower, how much could come from other energy sources. And solar energy is a big portion of what we believe is possible, especially in light of the changing economics. There are, of course, many barriers, and I think we'll get into some of that in the discussion on the panel. But we see a real potential for that, and so a lot of what we're focused on now is working with others in the region, with other organizations, as well as with the government, and with bringing in, through our connections to other countries, potential investors for these types of projects to make them real and show that it is possible. So with that, I will end. I had a couple of questions that maybe I can tee up for the panel, if it makes sense to do that now. The first was, we've seen recently that Thailand has come out with a new power development plan that is not as progressive, perhaps, as we had hoped in terms of non-hydropower renewables in it. On the other hand, Vietnam has a very progressive plan. There's a lot of projects in the pipeline in Vietnam for non-hydropower renewables. What is it that Cambodia can learn from those two different experiences? And is there a role for influencing that going forward? And then a second one was around this system scale planning versus the project by project planning. And clearly there are so many advantages to this big picture planning, but there are a lot of barriers to it as well. And I'm very curious to hear others' thoughts about what pathways you think might be viable for getting more of a system scale planning approach taken up within Cambodia. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Michelle. Clara.
Right. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. And I really wanted to begin by commending this great report that you've released. For my work on Asia, it is often very difficult to find good data on Cambodia, much less data that is thoughtful in its analysis and the way that it links it to the complex costs and trade-offs. So I think that on its own makes this a really phenomenal contribution to the literature. So if you have not had your chance to read it yet, I do highly endorse it. For my remarks, Brian and Courtney asked me if I could take a little bit of a different lens and look at this topic head on through the question of energy security and energy policy choices for decision makers. And there was a comment in the report that really struck me that I'm going to badly paraphrase here, which was something along the lines of, you know, when we think about hydropower, we need to be very honest in the costs and the real negative impacts in terms of ecology, in terms of environmental degradation, and lost economic activity due to disruption. And I think it went on to say something like, and that might mean including an honest assessment and evaluation, even acceptance of scenarios where coal and even natural gas could play a greater role in its energy mix. And I actually want to push that comment a little bit more for framing what my remarks are going to look at, which is, you know, when I've looked at some of the international models and scenarios for what might happen with Cambodia's own energy transition, there are a lot of assumptions that there's going to be a really phenomenal and huge growth uptick in coal consumption. And that's, you know, as we've already discussed, in line with other trends we're seeing in Southeast Asia. It has to do with the cliff of economic growth, combined with the fact that there's this really low electrification base, and so finding ways to increase that without energy becoming this bottleneck to an economic growth has a lot of trade-offs involved. Just to put this a little bit more bluntly in terms of the urgency and the scale of the challenge, IEJ area and the Ministry of Mines in Cambodia just came out with a study this week that said if you take all of those factors and kind of look at what's available and possible to meet that demand, what we're likely to see is between, I think, 2017 and 2040, the business as usual shows installed capacity for coal going from about 535 megawatts to 2,485 megawatts. That's even assuming some of the growth that we've been talking about and where hydropower tries to keep growth and pace with that. They modeled about 5 scenarios for alternatives on kind of what could change that mix. I think only their final scenario, their kind of combined all of the above scenarios, showed any kind of leveling off of what coal would look like, much less a decline in what's already there. And that included not just the hydropower that we've talked about, but more on top of that. Not exponentially much more, but more enough that it raises questions for me in terms of framing this. If we think long term about what's going to promote greater levels of energy security in Cambodia, what are the decision points that can help manage and check that coal curve, particularly through the lens of thinking about the phenomenal increase in CO2 emissions and air pollution that can indicate? And then where does not only hydropower fit into that, but increasingly where do wind and solar need to fit into that? And maybe just kind of 4 assumptions, questions that link to that for me. The first is talking very thoughtfully and clearly on what we mean when we say energy security, because traditionally that can mean a lot of different things for us. And it can mean just the hard-headed focus on the cost and economic growth, but increasingly we've talked about the important role of sustainability in there. The other question, I think this matters particularly for Asia, is the geopolitical dimension of energy. We've talked a little bit about concerns on reliance on imports and this kind of seeming cognitive dissonance of, well, if you're concerned about your reliance on imports, why is Cambodia looking at coal, which is not indigenous in the same way that it is to, say, Thailand or Mongolia, but would have to be met through imports? Some of that does have to do with other assumptions about coal in terms of its general abundance in the region. If your geopolitical anxiety is the potential for it to be cut off or used as kind of a tool of policy, as we've seen Russia, China to an extent, and other countries do, you don't have that same kind of anxiety about coal. We've seen supply chain disruptions, I think particularly since 2015 through currently based on weather patterns, but most of those tie to either a kind of slight uptick in cost or just rerouting to suppliers rather than a hard cutoff. Fair or not, and I would argue not fair. Sometimes the tag that renewable energy gets is, well, if the question is particularly for solar, you know, where do we get these supplies? What does our potential for growth look like? If you're a country such as Cambodia that does not have a strong manufacturing base for this, the question is that really an imported energy source? And more bluntly, is that an imported energy source that we know is overwhelmingly produced by one single country, China in particular? I think there are limitations to that argument. We can talk about that, but to put it out there is something that I think is on our mind when we think about the geopolitics of it. The second really important question and assumption, and Courtney touched on this some, is just making more explicit that comment about the rural-urban divide, which I thought was so important and critical in your point. We think about ASEAN as kind of urbanizing generally, some more rapidly than others, and that is occurring in Cambodia. But as of today, and I've seen a couple different statistics on this, somewhere between 60 and some of the high-end estimates even say 90% of the country still lives in the rural area. So when we talk about that really high rate of electricity prices in rural areas, the low access there, that's a substantial challenge for the country in terms of thinking about infrastructure development and thinking about the capacity that needs to be installed, and also doing this overwhelmingly in areas that don't have the kind of density that often justifies and brings down costs in more affordable ways. This has, I think, undeniably and importantly for Cambodia, led to the focus on what's the potential for off-grid energy sources, which is not just hydropower, but also importantly, wind and solar has a really good message there, and Cambodia has begun with rooftop solar and other options. Maybe just to do 30 seconds in defense of grids, one thing that grids do very well is they help bring down costs by realizing efficiencies of scale. The other thing they do is address some of the challenges that I think Courtney and Brian really well hit on their report, which is questions of intermittency. If you have a raise in demand or one fuel source that is a little bit lacking, having a comprehensive grid, even an ASEAN-wide level grid, allows you to move power from where it's accessible to where it's necessary. And that's something that can be done for its own good sake, but also specifically then makes wind and solar much more possible. Third point, and just to say it bluntly, can wind and solar play a much more important role in Cambodia? The answer is undeniably yes, because as Courtney and Brian hit on right now, it's really not playing any kind of role. So the question is, how much more significant of a role could it play? And I think it's important to talk about as they have the way that costs are coming down, but also being direct in some of the ways that this interacts with other priorities and needs in the country. We did a study about 2 years ago with APERC in Tokyo that looked at across ASEAN as well as other parts of Asia what's going on with trends in renewable energy. And the fundamental conclusion of this was, if you only ever filter through the question of, is wind and solar as cheap as coal, you're never going to get an answer that explains what you're actually seeing in development, which is in a lot of countries, not only is it that popular opinion polls rank wind and solar as the most socially acceptable fuel, enjoying widespread popular report, but to a degree, people are flexible on costs. That doesn't mean that they're willing to pay a significant premium, but they are willing to value it more than just the lowest quality fuel if, for example, it can make significant improvements in air pollution, other quality of life measures, which wind and solar has a good message on. That does raise the importance of getting the incentive systems right. If you want to do your best to realize what's going on in some of the markets right now, bringing down the costs, there are some better and worse practices on this. Maybe just to highlight kind of one example that occurs to me in the region is the experience that Japan has had in the last couple of years. Japan as well, also starting from a very low base on wind and solar, in their efforts to increase that, set a very ambitious very well developed, very well thought out plan for feed-in tariffs that were looking to balance both wind and solar. What happened? Why did it struggle? Solar costs came down significantly, which is a fundamental good. The challenge is the system was set up for all things being equal, there not to be an incentive to choose wind over solar or solar over wind. And so costs coming down, they didn't get the balance that they had prepared for in the grid. That's not to say don't do it. That's to say that the way that you want to set incentives should have regular mechanisms for check-in, for revisiting what your assumptions are about the technology, so you can both take advantage of those, but also make further refinements in national planning as necessary. I could go on for much longer, but maybe last comment would be, how do we think about bringing this all back to the big picture strategic question that I think Brian and Courtney really well highlighted, which is, where's that space that national planners think about? What are the priorities that they have to look at? The Asian Development Bank did a really interesting study here that's about 5 years old now. I think it came out in 2014, looking at Cambodia's economic growth challenges, which are significant in terms of improving quality of life, its ability to move up the development curve further, maintain some of those growth rates. I think it showed it slowing down, but really wanting to further maximize this. And they outlined about, I want to say it was either somewhere between 5 and 8 categories of things that had to be urgent national priorities on government policymaker minds. And energy was just one of those plans. So the question is, anytime you talk about energy transitions or energy switches increasing prices, how do they impact spending resources available for some of the other tiers that are included in that mix, which include increasing spending on improving skill capacity through schools, through other education systems, through making upgrades to public health care systems. And the thing that I think this report did so well that isn't often acknowledged is not seeing that as exclusively an either or, which it's not. The fact being that making investments in one area can actually have positive gains for others. I thought, yeah. So maybe I will just stop there. Happy to come back to anything.
Thanks, Clara.
Yeah.
This is all very useful. And I have some responses, too. We're going to turn it to Jack from the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, who's been working, I believe, to promote investment interests among U.S. investors in Cambodia and the Mekong region at large. And Jack, I'm going to ask you to keep your comments to 5 minutes so we have enough time for a discussion.
Absolutely, I'll
with
try
the
my
audience.
best.
Thanks.
Well, first of all, Brian and Courtney, thank you for having me here, and congratulations once again on the publication of your report. Very comprehensively, very well done. Kudos to you both. Brian, when you mentioned earlier about the irresponsible farming in the flooded forests of the Tonle Sap and how that have raised concern, and that there's more loss, that the loss far outweigh the economic growth. When you mentioned that to me, I hear an opportunity for our American agriculture companies out there to be interacting with these farmers, to train, educate, and support them on agriculture technology. Perhaps even partner with USAID, with the State Department, those kinds of initiatives. And Courtney, when you talk about the Cambodia's Master Energy Plan with JICA, primarily being hydropower focused and in part coal focused, with not including any other alternative energy sources, that actually resonates with the Council's Cambodia Committee advocacy on the need to reach a sustainable and effective solution on the overlapping claims area with Thailand, which has large deposits of natural gas and oil. So those issues came to mind the most, right? So just a little bit about me. Full disclosure, I am not a water or energy expert by any means. I'm just tagging along with this, but I do know about American investment interests in Cambodia, and how our interests are aligned with Cambodia's development, overall development agenda. So I'll be speaking very briefly about that today. Cambodia has always been an interesting market for the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, and we've always believed in its economic growth potential. Its youth population, which is under 30 of which, under 30 aged youth population makes up over 65% of the overall population. Moreover, a huge percentage of the Cambodian population has a very positive outlook towards the American brand. And by that I mean the overall American brand. When youth go out to do study groups, they go to Starbucks. When folks get their first car, they go for Ford. When they order pizza, it's Domino's. It's that kind of positive outlook towards the American brand, the American idea, and American consumer products that make Cambodia a very attractive market for us. Now, another positive factor to mention is a two-way trade between our two countries, which is at $4 billion this 2018. And because of that, because of the public sentiment towards America as a country and American products in general, the government has been very accommodating to us in our regular outreaches to them, in our advocacy outreaches to them. I'll give you a few examples. So Cambodia is the first country in ASEAN when Uber entered its market that introduced a ride-sharing legislation. That was an advocacy push by U.S. business that passed. Cambodia offered QIPs to Coca-Cola when it's opened its first facility there, bottling plant down there in 2013, I believe. So those positive interactions between business and government has been ongoing until the post-election environment of the July 2018 general elections, where we are now seeing potential bills in the U.S. Congress, one being the Cambodia Democracy Act, another being the Cambodia Trade Act, that aims to punish the Cambodian government on alleged violations of election laws and action taken against the media and the dissolution of the main opposition party, CNRP. Now, I am not in any way, just want to make that clarification, refuting punishing those who may have violated certain values that the U.S. is not in sync with, but however, potential legislation that would cause a major impact, that would hurt the overall trade relationship, I think just hurts the average Cambodian day-to-day worker. And more importantly, reduces the U.S.'s, and particularly U.S. business interests' influence in the country. Because in the alternative, you have China right at their doorstep, knocking on at every chance that it can get to enter their market. And we have seen that already. Sihanoukville is pretty much all Chinese-owned at this point, the infrastructure projects that are going on there. And unlike the public sentiment towards America, public sentiment towards China is actually 180 degrees. You see that a lot. I've been to Cambodia time and time, and I've spoken with folks in mid-level, folks in the bureaucracy to the average layman out there. And they say the exact same things, that we feel that China is encroaching on Cambodian sovereignty. And this, we feel, is like a modern-day colonialism. So that is one thing to keep in mind. Do I still have time, Brian, to go over a little bit about the OCA?
About 1 minute.
About 1 minute? Okay, well, the overlapping claims area that I mentioned earlier as an energy source, as an energy alternative, is one of the key issues that we've been advocating for Cambodia to reach a settlement, and settlement quick, with the Thais. Now, this is a 27,000 square kilometer area, which rests on the Gulf of Thailand, right on the Patani Basin, which actually comprises about 1/3 of the Patani Basin, as a matter of fact, and it has the potential to create 1.4 to 3.6 billion barrels of oil, or actually 15 trillion cubic feet in natural gas, so that it holds that much potential. And in terms of, we break that down in terms of revenue, it can bring about US dollars 35 billion into both economies. So this is a great opportunity. This is a great setup that has been laid out for both Thailand and Cambodia, but there is a holdup. So why is there a holdup? Well, that both countries cannot agree on a sharing of its cultivation, or a joint venture with the private sector to have the OCA reach its full potential? Well, one is their different fiscal regimes. Their tax and royalty systems are very different, and they could not reach an agreement on that front. Their inability to reach an agreement on profit sharing. So Cambodia is still very much a non-producer of oil and gas, and while Thailand has been doing this, have been doing this in their western border for several years. So Thailand favors dividing the OCA in vertical trenches, while Cambodia prefers horizontal blocks with equal access to the western portion of the OCA. And the other factor is national pride. So Cambodia's border north of the OCA used the Thai island of Koh Koh as a demarcation line, and it actually stretches 75 nautical miles north. It goes into the Gulf of Thailand to mark its territory, where the Thai side disagreed with the use of its Koh Koh Thailand and stated that the territorial limit should be based on the continental shelf. So that back and forth, in addition to the domestic politics in Thailand, particularly when the red shirts are in power, the yellow shirts would be against the issue, and the yellow shirts are in power, the reds would be against the issue, and that back and forth has caused several delays, actually decades of delay, in this matter. Now we have seen a resurgence, particularly on the Cambodian side, to push this issue as a major energy priority. And hopefully by the end of we have major elections in Thailand coming up. So by the end of those elections, with the new government in place, that we hope that some deal would be reached. And when a deal is reached, however, that would take up to a decade for OCA to start putting out its full potential. So it's an option. It's a long way down the line with both net economic gains and energy gains that can act as an alternative to simply just hydro and coal. And that's what we've been advocating for. And my question. My question is, we see that the ruling party, as it stands, has been cultivating a new generation of progressive-minded, more Western-leaning leaders to take over the helm of government. How do you think that shift and that potential change impacts the trajectory for renewable energy in the overall policy making? Thank you. And I may be over a few minutes, so I apologize.
No worries, Jack. Well, Jack has taken us from the Mekong to the ocean, right? And demonstrated that the geography matters, in a broad sense, but also the political processes inside of Cambodia and geopolitics matter. And this is something that, Clara, you touched on as well. So I'm going to try to provide a very quick answer to tie all this up, including Michelle's question about how to bring system scale planning forward for Cambodia's portion of the Mekong, and then turn it over to all of you for questions and discussion. And I know many of you here also work on issues in Cambodia and the Mekong at large, so not only are we interested in your questions, but your comments as well. In our report, we give 5 recommendations to the Cambodian government, and the last is to facilitate a robust democratic process and democratic processes to gain sustainable development dividends. That the democratic processes and transparent processes at work in Cambodia have consistently displayed how the country can move forward in a more environmentally friendly way with the provision of more resources to communities. And that goes for the opposition parties that are in Cambodia, for Cambodia's free media, what used to be free and transparent media, and then Cambodia's robust civil society engagement with these countries. So we hope that recommendation can be taken to heart. Now that we're past the national elections, perhaps there's a window for this. But another recommendation of the 4 is to utilize Cambodia's National Council for Sustainable Development to develop a coordinated national plan for basin-wide water and energy development that promotes non-hydropower renewables. So Cambodia has something that's unique that the rest of the countries in the Mekong doesn't have. And this is a council that's nested underneath the Ministry of Environment, which is manned by a very progressive young Minister of Environment, Mr. Saisamal. This council is an interagency platform, so it brings in stakeholders and decision makers from various ministries across Cambodia to discuss sustainable development issues. No other country in the Mekong region has this. And we have, we've mooted our suggestions and run through these concepts with the National Council for Sustainable Development, as well as Cambodia's Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fishery, and Ministry of Economy and Finance. And those are the three that jump out of their seats and say, when can we do this? You know, and they get it the best, more so than any other set of stakeholders that we interact with in the region. So I think, you know, those times are coming. If this type of progressive leadership can build enough political will to bring these processes forward. The officials on the council are like, what do we do? Well, we say, write a report to your superiors and ask for this type of analysis. And in many ways, the way forward is both a technical capacity building project to develop these scenarios and system scale planning efforts. But also there's the need for skilling, which you mentioned, Clara, for skilling up so that these development projects aren't ones where you have people parachuting in for a year or two and then leaving and there's no capacity built. So I'll leave my response to that there and open it up to the rest of the audience for questions and comments. We'll have about 10 minutes for this. And I'm going to call on our former intern, Kevin Rutigliano, to run the mic. And perhaps if you'd like, give us the first question since you have the mic. We'll take 3 questions or comments and then provide a response. And please identify yourself, and if you have a question for one of the speakers or all of us, let us know to whom you're asking. Jenna. This will capture your audio so that the live stream hears.
Okay, great. So I'm Jenna Scheinen. I work at the Department of State at the Office of Conservation and Water. Sorry, I had to remember. So thanks all of you. This was fantastic. Helps us think about, you know, ways diplomacy can assist in all of these efforts. And I'm going to ask sort of an obnoxious question. Heard a lot about energy and water and even some environment, but only one of you really sort of touched on the food aspect, not a lot on the food piece of the nexus. And so I know there was a little bit of mention of ag technology, or I'm curious for all of the panelists where you see food security fitting into this mix as well.
Others? Rich.
Okay, thanks. This is Rich Cronin. I am a fellow at Stimson now, but I was previously Brian's my successor. And so this has been great. And by the way, I mean, I couldn't be happier at how the program's continuing after I've retired from it. But two questions I put on the table. One is the issue of the role of the private sector, and I'm thinking more in terms of pushing forward on solar and wind in particular, and the other is China has come up briefly, but there's concern that China's OBOR and its other so-called aid projects, its loans and whatnot to Mekong countries, lower Mekong countries, is absorbing their ability to borrow for better purposes and at better rates, for instance, from the ADB. ADB keeps talking about bankable projects, and they're not bankable if there's no scope for paying off the loans. Thanks.
One more. If not, we'll take a stab at these. And again, anyone can. Oh, sorry, Jocelyn. Jocelyn.
I'll ask another one, Brian.
Go ahead, Mike.
Did you look at any other river system worldwide to draw corollaries to your work for the Mekong?
Excellent question. Thank you. And then Jocelyn.
Hi, thank you, everyone. This is really helpful for my work and very informative. I'm Jocelyn Roberts. I'm working at the Department of State as well on Lower Mekong Initiative. My question is, you mentioned somewhere 97% electrification rate for Phnom Penh, which was sort of astounding to me. But I'm also curious, compared to 10 years ago when I used to work there, are they still having rolling blackouts? Because it was scheduled all during the dry season, blackouts Monday morning, 8 to noon, Tuesday afternoon, 1 to 5, that kind of thing, just continuous, 1 to 4. And so there's one piece is, who does the grid reach? You spoke a lot about the sort of, maybe if I can say, the environmental quality of the energy that's being supplied, but then there's also a question about the distribution network, the infrastructure, and kind of the quality of distribution, I guess, and how does that impact the total demand projections that we're getting. There was also mention about the new Thailand Power Development Plan, which I didn't realize was out, so I'll have to look that up. But I guess in the back of my mind, my question is, did they revise down their total, out to 2030 power demand projection because they realized that they could actually do more with energy efficiency? And just so quality of infrastructure and how that impacts energy demand.
So let's take comments from the entire panel, if you'd like, starting with Michelle and run down here, and then I'll provide final comments and wrap it up.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll touch on the food security question and the one about other river systems. So in terms of food security, I think clearly the fishery in the Mekong is critical for food security. I think it's something like 250 million people rely on the fishery for their protein needs. I may have that number.
250,000 directly.
Okay.
On the lake, there are 400,000 individuals.
I'm thinking about the entire Mekong, not just.
So we often use 66 million.
66.
Draw resources
Thank you,
from
Brian.
I should apologize if you were late. So if you could cover this before, we're thinking beyond just the fishery too.
Right.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I mentioned earlier was that there are a lot of unintended impacts on food security from the impacts on the fishery, because there was a study done by Orr et al. That looked at with full build out of the dams in the Mekong, what the impact would be on protein supply and where would the protein come from for those populations, those 66 million people, and that it could, you'd have to find land to grow the food, to feed the animals, and so on and so forth. So I think that while we often think of these as like, oh, this is a river conservation issue, there's so many linkages, and you're right on it, that nexus question. And I think that, yes, the implications of where dams are located in the system have huge potential impacts on food security issues across the region. In terms of other rivers, we've done that at WWF, and in fact, I would argue that much of the work that we're doing in other places is learning from the work in the Mekong, because we've been engaged on this issue of dam development for the longest, I think, there, and we were very strongly advocating against the Xayaburi Dam, and that did not go the way we had hoped, which cuts off a huge portion of the upper Mekong and is having impacts downstream. So we learned a lot from that, and I think a lot of this looking at alternatives approach and trying to put solutions on the table is part of recognizing some of the lessons that we learned from that. There's been some really strong work in Myanmar as well, where the IFC has funded a strategic environmental assessment for hydropower for the country, and one of the recommendations coming out of that is to keep the main stems of the Irrawaddy and Salween free-flowing because of the really critical role that they play for fishery supply, sediment flows to the delta, and so on.
Maybe touch on two of the questions, the Belt and Road Initiative and what's going on there. So about 2 years ago now, just to do a little plug for this, NBR did a major study on the energy dimensions of the Belt and Road. And unsurprisingly, what we found is if you look at in aggregate the projects that China has been involved in, what kind of the early indicators are involved, it's disproportionately coal as well as hydropower in this mix. And that's for a couple of reasons, including that this is an area where China has strong domestic strengths, but also equally important, it's an area where the international community is really lacking in financing in a lot of cases. You have blocks in the United States, Japan, others, in terms of financing coal projects, unless it meets these very specific exceptions or highest quality standards. China fills a much larger delta in that, as you can imagine, and similar questions on hydropower. So when we first started doing this study, the response that we heard, particularly in Southeast Asia, was not this view that there's this undeniable good about doing coal, or they were unaware that this could have offsets, but more for the resources that they had and for what was really possible in their reach. The best way to move up that curve was to access the financing that was available that looked at what was under the Belt and Road. Now, we have seen more pushback and questions there in the last year on, well, what are the strings attached? How high are these potential debt burdens involved on it? Maybe just one other point, because you hit on it. The other interesting thing with bankable and thinking about risk is the extent to which traditionally we're not talking about climate risk, which is really what changes that equation. We're talking about some of the basic operating principles, which, again, coal can be easier to set up and just let work versus other systems which are more complex, nuanced, have higher requirements for skill capacity. And that's an area where I would say it's not necessarily that China is absorbing all the energy in the room for them to make more and better decisions. It is something where it's pushing some of the major international institutions, such as ADB, to think more creatively about what's possible. Think about what it means in terms of some of these innovative investment mechanisms for wind and solar that can make it more possible to address the kind of front-end costs, but in the longer term, pay themselves back. Thinking about what some of those upfront loans could look like that might have different or more flexible terms. On Thailand's basic energy plan, or their energy blueprint, maybe just a comment or two, and some of this is informed by having seen multiple rounds of the drafts and discussions there, and could be slightly off in some of the numbers with the final release on that, so I apologize. It is banking very heavily on investments in energy efficiency. As a huge source of growth, it's thinking more comprehensively about district heating and cooling, a lot of other things that can help to flatten and manage that demand curve, alongside the role for renewable energy, which Thailand has great potential on. If I had to summarize my thoughts and reactions to the idea of where it's less ambitious than it should be, it's specifically on the coal-gas nexus. Thailand traditionally gets a lot of its electricity generated from natural gas, which overwhelmingly has been an indigenous domestic source. And the potential domestic production versus where the demand curve is going has become a little bit more out of sync. And so where it's been disappointing for me is that in reverse to most other countries in the region that are thinking, can we make that coal-gas switch? Thailand has been more anxious about, should we make the gas-coal switch? Again, because it's an option that's possible, because they feel that there is a good message if they can set the incentives right. Maybe it can be cleaner coal. That's just a conversation that has to have long-term. And one last point that I think has important implications for Cambodia is the anxiety about land use
the idea that even if we develop wind and solar, this is something that's going to take agricultural land out of commission. That's going to be kind of an offset balance, which is something I thought was a really interesting and great point in your report, which is we have to be direct and clear communicating. Cambodia does have this great option of saying it's not that trade-off. It's actually land that's being unused that could be tapped and add new benefit rather than a trade-off. So.
Unfortunately, Jack had to run off to another meeting, so I will take a brief stab at answering the question that Rich raised about the role of the private sector in pushing solar and wind. And I think it's important to recognize that the amount of investment interest from the private sector has been one of the key drivers in the changes we've started to see in Cambodia and in sort of the long-term development of solar and wind in Thailand, where they've already met halfway their goal for their 2036 target for solar. A lot of that's because of the private sector coming in and really taking advantage of those policies and driving this iterative shift in policy in Thailand. Now, the power development plan is, again, not as ambitious in that scope as many outsiders would like it to be. Unless something new has come out in the last few days, my understanding is they actually have not released the final PDP. There was an announcement in January in the papers that it had been finalized and then no subsequent information came. So I think it is actually still hotly debated internally. But on that note, for Cambodia, I think one of the big factors moving forward with solar and wind is going to be shifts in the regulatory system. There has been an ongoing debate, for instance, about a use of metered tracking of you know, for instance, rooftop solar or warehouse top solar for private sector investment. You know, to what extent can they sell that power back into the grid? Until very recently, that there was just a policy in place that without very specific special permission, nobody could sell power back into their grid. And in many cases, there was even a requirement that if you had a solar system for your house or for your company, you couldn't run that system if it was connected to the grid. You had to choose between the two. So having discussions about, you know, the reasons for those investments, the benefits for the system from those investments, and a wide swath of other regulatory issues ranging from power purchase agreement terms to permitting. The private sector has a key role to play there in advising, bringing experiences from other countries that have been successful with the deployment of solar and wind into the country. But the government will need to respond, and it probably will be a very iterative shift moving forward.
Thanks, Courtney, and thank you to our panelists, one of which who has left, which reminds us that we're over time. So I will leave 2 points. One on food, that when we delivered the results of our study to Cambodia's Ministry of Water and Meteorology, a very senior level official there said, hey, all this fish stuff, you know, we're shifting to a time where children in our country want to eat KFC. And there are like 4 KFCs in all of Cambodia. And to have that statement put out there shows that there's still a mismatch in the understanding of how important fisheries are contributing to the Cambodian diet, because we believe in the data that we put in here, that 70% of the protein in the country comes from that freshwater fish catch. And there are young, educated Khmer people, academics like Julia O, whose work is cited in here, and Minister Sai Samal, who's a freshwater ecologist. He did his PhD dissertation on the Tonle Sap, who can drive forward the importance of food conservation and fisheries conservation in the kingdom. And then the final point is on China's Belt and Road. You know, how China interacts with Cambodia in the next 5 years is going to make or break Cambodia's Mekong. Just put that out there. Those dams in that inventory, the orange dams, many of them are owned, the MOUs are owned by Chinese developers. So this is an opportunity for China to take a stab at some programmatic visions, because of the few countries out there that can do programmatic policymaking around energy, China is one of them. And how China moves forward, we will have to see. But that other scenario that I put up there of building above the Lower Sesan 2 dam is one where China doesn't necessarily have total control over the future. So this is an opportunity for states like Vietnam, for the US, Indo-Pacific programming to go in and promote a sustainable future in this part of the world. Now, I problematized that particular scenario. It needs a lot more, a much deeper look in terms of the impacts to ethnic peoples, upland peoples, and their own resource use in that part of Cambodia. So those are my 2 quick answers. I want to thank everyone for coming out today. This has been a really enlightening discussion. I learned a lot from our discussants, and it just goes to show when you ask some of your friends and colleagues to speak to these things, not in a coffee or lunch type setting, that you learn new things. Thank you for coming today. A few quick plugs. I want to thank the MacArthur Foundation, the State Department's Lower Mekong Initiative, and the embassy, the U.S. Embassy at Phnom Penh for providing support in both the composition and the release of this report. We've got an excellent map maker who put together the images in this report. Her name is Allison Carr. She's a former student of mine, and she's just delivers some very powerful visuals. And I want to thank Dr. Richard Cronin for his peer review of this, among many other peer reviewers, in addition to Cambodia's National Mekong Commission, who took part in the peer review of this project. Coming down the pike for us, well, I've recently released my book, Last Days in the Mighty Mekong, which takes a deep dive into the processes of the Tonle Sap and what produces that fisheries explosion of population in a way that everyone can understand. And we have 2 more reports coming out this year. One is on the future of the U.S. role in the Mekong region, and a second will be another specific investigation of how Thailand can rise as a sustainability leader within the region and promote a smart water, energy, and future for the Mekong. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you next time.
The comments on the rural-urban divide were so fascinating that I was like, I have to talk about this more because it's one of those things I think tends to be very overlooked when people talk about power. They tend to think about like the industrial zones, cities, like the modern lifestyle. Well, and everyone's urbanizing, and I then like tried to do this deeper dig into like under what pace, under what timeline, and the best I could find was like there's no clear data on that for Cambodia, but we can't ignore the fact that like overwhelmingly that's what it is now, and that's when you have to make the infrastructure decisions that don't have the base.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we were most interested in that didn't get as much time here just because we didn't have the chance to really do more field work on it was sort of the off-grid, like microgrid aspect of things. I mean, that's one area that, you know, when we tend to take the regional perspective, it's hard to take the regional perspective and then also go in and really get that. So we don't have the data for that, basically. So we really need the